Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for August 27th, 2013. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. I'm joined today by John Markley and Matt Keyser, and I'm John Hogoboom. So our first story that we're going to cover is one that I kind of wanted to talk about real quickly. And it comes off of the CSO Online website. They posted a study that found that there's a big gap between what the executives in a company think about the quality of their app security versus what the actual IT staff thinks. So I thought this was interesting and probably not a big surprise that there's somewhat of a disconnect between what management thinks the level of their security is with respect to their software and their applications versus what the actual IT staff does, who's probably either implementing it or using it a lot more. So what they found is, 67% of the executives, around the same numbers with respect to the directors and managers, believe that their company's application security program is mature. And then, on the contrary, less than a third of the technicians and staff actually agree with that perception. One of the things that I thought was a good insight out of this, and, we've talked in the past that I was a developer in a previous life, so it's no surprise to me that there's, from a lot of my coworkers and other people that I interacted with in the development space, that more often than not, they're not very security-minded, and they usually don't have a lot of security background or mindset when they're doing their software development. So one of the things I think is a good idea that companies might want to look into is, beyond just investing in your network security layers like web application firewalls and IPSs, IDSs, things like that, look into, helping your developers more and maybe give them some training. So, one of the good ideas is to maybe run once a year a how to hack your web apps type of class that you could give to developers. And believe it or not, I think you'll find that there'll be a big return on your investment there. You'd probably be surprised how many developers are out there that really don't know what a SQL injection attack is or what a cross-site scripting attack is or how to recognize that some code that they've written is actually vulnerable to that type of exploit. Just an observation. It's a good article. Some people might want to check it out. I think it's an interesting insight, not necessarily a big surprise other than the fact that there was such a large gap, in my opinion, between what the senior management and the actual people, boots on the ground, felt about their app security and maturity of that, maturity of that program within their companies.
We know that, when you do an app scan or something of that nature, you find all these vulnerabilities. And is it possible that that's not getting given to the executives, to their desk, or they're not seeing it or not interpreting it correctly, or just not even running it?
I don't know if they specifically called that out in the article in terms of what the communication. Obviously, there's a communication gap, right, between what the guys in the field are aware of versus what the executives are aware of. A lot of the investment that gets pushed down in terms of financial commitment to improving the security around your applications is usually in the network space. We're kind of familiar with that. People put IPSs in, IDSs, firewalls. They try to protect all of these assets, but they're not really focusing as much on the applications themselves. And as we know, as security people, more often than not, it's the software that's the problem, not the network layer. How often do you see a network vulnerability? Not to say that it doesn't happen, but in terms of when you look at the number of exploits and vulnerabilities come out, they're usually related to software or how that software works and accepts a network connection, but not necessarily the underlying network and how the data and network communications occurs. So
we all know that the days of the firewall and the hard perimeter are gone and gone for a long time now.
Right. And, a lot of people are moving in the direction of web application firewalls. I think that's a great idea. But, again, it's a layer. So it's not the only thing. And it's going to stop a lot of those common types of exploits that you might see. But I still think that you really need to take a hard look at what your people think inside your company, especially the developers and those involved in, writing the code behind your web applications or other software, and whether they think it's safe, even if they have an inkling that something might not smell right, or I'm not quite sure that I know what to look for security-wise. That's a good indication that you probably need a little more training or bring in some programs to help developers understand security impacts that, around the types of applications they're developing. All right, so interesting story. I'd recommend everybody check that one out. The next story on our list here is one from Matt. So Matt, I guess some people might still be running Windows XP out there, and if they are, they should be watching out.
They should. The real deadline, in my opinion, is April 8th, 2014, which is the day that Windows XP is going to be end of life. That means no security patches, no application hotfixes, no nothing. And that's very important because if a security hole comes out in Windows XP, it will not be fixed. Now, the usual patch cycle that we're all accustomed to is Patch Tuesday, when Microsoft will roll out a patch for everything that it's recently fixed. And these days, those patches do include support for Windows XP problems if the vulnerability applies. However, what happens on those days is that criminals will typically reverse engineer those patches to come out with an exploit, which is why people will say you have Patch Tuesday, you got to worry about Exploit Wednesday. So the advice has always been patch early, patch often, and get these things handled because the support is there. Unfortunately, what's going to happen once there's no more support for XP is that these patches will not apply for XP even if the vulnerability does apply. So what you'll see is that criminals will reverse engineer the patch, find out that it applies to XP by testing on their own, and they've got a vulnerability that's effectively a 0-day forever because there will not be a patch for it. The obvious suggestion in this case is to move away from XP as soon as you can, simply because you don't want to be dealing with this any longer. The harder part to this is that some systems will use XP in an embedded way, certain medical devices, ATMs, and other platforms that don't necessarily allow you to replace the operating system. But definitely a good thing to be aware of if you're a home user still using XP, and definitely if you're a corporation still using XP.
What makes this more difficult than like people running Windows 3 or Windows Vista? Why is XP more at risk?
Well, actually, Windows 3 is about as at risk as Windows XP at this point because it's long out of support. Windows Vista is still in support, so you will be getting patches on a regular basis. But once XP is out, you're pretty much dealing with the vulnerabilities on your own. And maybe you can come up with a mitigation with some sort of firewalling or some sort of other measure that will prevent the vulnerability from even occurring. Configure your firewall properly, set up IDS, IPS maybe, or maybe you've got some other magic up your sleeve. But it's very similar to any other Windows operating system that goes out of support.
Unlike a lot of the previous, and this is just my observation, when you look at like the Microsoft operating systems that have been out there, such as you mentioned Windows 3 and 95, 98, Windows ME, when XP came around, people really have been clinging to this one. XP was really a very stable, not to say that the other ones aren't either, since then. I'm a big fan of Windows 7 and Windows 8. But Windows XP, a lot of people have really clung on to it, and there's still a lot of, like you said, embedded types of devices that use Windows XP as an underlying operating system for whatever their appliance or application is. So it's some good insight there. And if you're aware, some people might not even be aware that XP is the underlying system for whatever, if it is an embedded type device. And there's probably still a lot of home users, like you said, out there that are still using it. They really should move forward, I would think. The newer versions of Windows are really good. I would highly recommend them. Not to say, Windows XP was really good, and I think it was so good that a lot of people have been hanging on to it for quite a long time. But they need to move on. It's time to move on, and you've got, I guess less than half a year or so, maybe half a year, to make your plans to transition away from there. Especially if it's an important system, you should really look into that because you're not going to be getting patches in the future.
Yeah, I can remember working a case, not too long ago, an incident where a company had cameras, and one camera was running Linux and one camera was running Windows, and I don't remember what version of Windows it is. So it is kind of confusing and important to know what your products are running and what some of these end of life or patching requirements are for everything you run.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, sometimes you have no idea because you don't even have, in a lot of occasions, those types of devices, you don't even have a visibility into what the OS might be underneath. If you do know, it's a good thing. And the other thing about a lot of these embedded devices, we talk about that all the time, is that usually they're drag and drop. You drop it into your network, you hook it up, and you never patch the thing. So that's a whole other issue in and of itself. But Matt has some good points that he brought up here. XP, there's probably still a decent-sized embedded base out there. I'd like to actually know how much is still out there. It'd be an interesting study to find out how much is still, out there in the world. I suspect that the numbers are probably large enough to be surprising to most people. All right. So we have another story that you're covering, Matt. So I guess DDoS as a service has become, more widespread than just with gamers and whatnot.
Yep. So a paper came out of a recent Usenix conference, authors Mohammed Karami and Damon McCoy, and they actually managed to get a database dump from a popular booter service. Now, if you're not familiar with those, booter services, also known as stressors, are basically DDoS for hire tools. Booters being the name given to them by gamers who use them to kick their rivals offline during a match, and stressors being the name given to them to sort of legitimize the service, whereas you would pay a company to stress test your website to see how much traffic it could handle. In reality, many of these services are sold on the underground explicitly as DDoS services. So it's sort of a euphemism in that respect. But again, this group of researchers was able to get a database dump of the content of one of these booter services. I won't mention the name. They don't deserve any more press than they've already got. And they were able to find out, the sort of customers they've got and other statistics about what actually happens in one of these booter services. What I found interesting is that there were a very wide range of different targets being attacked by these users. There was a large number of users, and a total of about 10,000 different IP addresses targeted, anywhere from individual IP addresses in what you would call, I guess, ISP space, where it would be a home user, all the way up to government websites and the website of a large city's police department. It seems to scale all the way from very short-range attacks of about 10 minutes, most likely for ticking off gamers, all the way up to a total of 142 hours for some of those larger government sites. These people, this isn't just sort of a fly-by-night operation. They're set up, they've got a whole website interface where you can log in through the web with your credentials, pay by PayPal, and then specify your targets that way. These attackers do use proxy servers to obfuscate the source of attacks, although it seems that for this service, only about, I think, 10 servers were ever owned at one time by the operators. And the booter apparently made about $7,000 to $8,000 for its owner in a single month. So some interesting statistics about DDoS as a service as it stands today. Some important points to mention that booters make it very simple for anyone to kick off a DDoS attack. All it really takes is probably an email address to log in and a little bit of cash. So, if you're thinking this is mostly for kids playing around on Xbox Live and kicking each other off, you're really mistaken. Anybody could feasibly turn this against your company, and it would be very, very simple for them to do so. If you Google for the term booter or stressor, you'll find in the top results the one that we mentioned today, along with a score of others who, all could be used in the same way. Anyone who knows the word booter and has a little bit of cash lying around could feasibly do this. Another point to make is that recently the source code for the popular Asylum booter tool was leaked. This allows a lot of other people to get on board, set up their own booter services, and offer them. So the market is expanding. It's not as constrained as it used to be. And a very important point, yes, this is illegal. So anyone who's harboring thoughts of maybe using this really ought not to.
Yeah, interesting story. I agree with you. these booter services that are out there, in terms of, I looked at some of them, and while they're strong, they're not the super strongest in terms of stressing a network connection that I've ever seen. But they're certainly got enough bandwidth and power behind them to take out a home user who generally doesn't have a lot of bandwidth to begin with. You might be on a DSL line or a cable line, and that's why it's marketed or used a lot by these gamers. But like you said, these mid-sized companies that also don't have enormous amounts of bandwidth available to them or computing resources, these booter and stressor services can definitely do a number on them. And as you said, there's definitely evidence to that case. We look at a lot of DDoS attacks in AT&T, or that we see coming across the AT&T common backbone, and more often than not, they're these smaller ones like these ones you're describing here, where they're a mid-sized company or government website or home users. Other times, larger ones not using stressor services, using botnets, can rally a lot more strength and attack other larger targets as well. So not to be discounted, definitely something to be mindful of. I guess it's one of those weird, it is illegal. It's kind of a weird gray area, though, because they market themselves as stressor services. They're offering a service to let you test how much bandwidth you can absorb, how much attack traffic you can absorb. And that's kind of a weird thing, right?
I'm sure on their website they all say, please only use this against a site that you own.
Right.
But in reality, they'll probably accept cash to point it at any site you want.
Yeah, no doubt. Okay, so the next story we have is one that you've been looking into, John. I guess somebody snuck a malicious app into the Apple App Store?
Yeah, it's really an interesting story on how apps become legitimate in that they go actually onto the app stores like Apple's or Google's. And in this case, there's not a lot of knowledge behind why some things make it, why some things don't. And so some researchers at Georgia Tech did some studies, and they actually presented this study at the USNIX conference that the last story was also talked about. And what they did is they codenamed this Jekyll, and back in March timeframe of this year, they put this app out on the Apple Developers App Store to get it into the official distribution. And what they did is they actually took the code and they divided it up and made like little microcode. There's a technical term for it, but what they did is they actually took this code and they split it up, and it didn't assemble itself until actually after it had already been running for a certain amount of time. And so when the app is being tested by the evaluation software tools, if it doesn't test it long enough for a certain amount of time, it may miss the fact that this behind the scenes app is being reconstituted. And in this case, exactly that happened. Is that the app was put onto the Apple App Store all clean, all happy, and the researchers at Georgia Tech were able to figure out, hey, I can do, with my app that they wrote, they can control the device, they could pull sensitive information, they could load other software. It was all these things that they found that they could do that shouldn't have gotten through the verification steps. This was all, kind of done, I don't necessarily want to say legitimate, because obviously, I'm sure Apple wasn't quite aware of it at the time. But what they did is they took that app's no longer available, and Apple themselves have tweaked their tools and corrected this problem or this issue. So this type thing shouldn't happen. So it's an interesting thing. To me, it's not necessarily the App Store vetting process per se. It's the concept of taking disparate pieces of code and after a certain amount of time or certain condition, putting them back together such that they make a new product or a new process. There was a thing that I got to thinking about the other day is what would stop somebody from embedding little pieces of code in a dozen apps that by themselves, little pieces of code don't do anything, but that niche target that you're looking for, perhaps they may load those dozen apps or half dozen apps or whatever number. And so individually, each of these little piece parts don't necessarily become malicious or don't become these extra special functions. But together, if they're all loaded on my phone or my other, or even a PC, that together that conglomeration of these disparate products, together these little pieces, find each other and they merge and become this big, amoeba, where they're going out and able to do something new. So it is something that we have to consider, and it's a concept I don't think that's new, but it is one that we have to consider in that, with the proliferation of apps and app stores and products that make it out there, it's not that out of the question that we might see more and more of this type of functionality being, divided up and then after it's installed, put back together again and then not make it and not be detected even by a lot of the normal antivirus products.
Yeah, no, that is interesting, and I'm definitely familiar with other pieces of, I guess, your kind of mainstream malware that have used techniques where they'll pull in piece parts of other functionality, but maybe not to the degree of where you're pulling one half and another half separately. They don't do anything until you merge them together, and now you've got something that actually does something. So it is an interesting technique, one I haven't really thought about. I'm sure that it's probably, somebody might be aware of some other case where someone's done this. But one of the things I thought was interesting is, Apple. I think Apple's been doing a fantastic job, in my opinion, of vetting apps in general, much better than a lot of other vendors. But the thing that was takeaway for me is that they executed it for a period of time. And we know from the traditional malware space that a lot of the malware analysis systems already know that malware does that frequently, where it's going to go to sleep or it's going to wait for some condition to occur before it actually does what its malicious behavior. And a lot of the malware analysis systems already have devised techniques to see when there's a sleep in there to just not really sleep, to kind of ignore sleep routine or sleep functions inside code when it's executing. I'm aware of a lot of malware analysis systems that do that. So I would think that, Apple probably is doing something like that already. Maybe it was a really long time, or there was something else going in there that, especially with this merging of, various pieces of code and whatnot, that could come into play as well. But interesting story and interesting technique. Hopefully we don't see a lot more of it, and hopefully now that, Apple's seen it, and I'm sure the other vendors out there have as well, that they'll be able to recognize that type of behavior and prevent it from getting into the app stores, because we all rely on our phones.
If a particular app is asking for access to your address book, you got to ask yourself why, if it's not applicable. And I think some of those things can be caught just by awareness of what the app itself is trying to do and what it's asking for.
You had one more story that you were looking at, John, and one I actually liked because it's nice and kind of quick and simple, but some security checks that people can check on their smartphones or something like that?
Yeah, that's good, John. Yeah, the interesting thing is, one of the things that we all do, in the security realm, as well as with our, basic human nature to, just to poke around at things, right, in the, the computer people. We're always Googling things, whether it's our own name or anything else. One of the things I like to check for is smartphone security. And I actually ran across this website, this FCC, and that is the, Federal Communications, the FCC Smartphone Security Checker. And it's a neat little tool that allows them or anyone to really, go to there and say, I have this type of phone, and what can I do to make myself more secure? What can I be aware of to make myself more secure? And you can actually choose the type of operating system that you have on your handset. It's really these basic 10 tenets of smartphone security, and then if you go to each of those operating systems, it will tell you, here's how to do this on an Android, here's how to do this on a BlackBerry, here's how to do this on a Windows phone. So it actually breaks that down for you. So the 10 tenets and all of these, it's tough to talk about it because sometimes they just seem so common sense, but people just don't think sometimes about what they need to be doing on a phone, because it is really a computer nowadays. So the 10 steps are, set your pins and passwords. Don't leave your phone unlocked. It's just, go to a password. Don't modify the smartphone security settings, right? There's that includes rooting and similar functionality where you're trying to get additional permissions. What the concern there is that when you take away the inherent security of the device or modify it, you've left yourself open. Back up and secure your data. Those are only install apps from trusted sources. We just talked about some of that with the apps from the App Store. You want to go to the good apps, the Google Plays, the BlackBerry Worlds, the Apple App Store. You want to go to those good places because you can trust them, and you really can. So you don't know what you're getting if you go to Joe's App Store out in Russia somewhere, or whatever. You just got to be real careful about what you're doing. App permissions, I just mentioned that as well. You want to know that if it asks you, hey, can I have access to your contact list? You think to yourself, why does it need to know my contacts? Those are the type of things that you have to consider. Install security apps. Most of the devices nowadays come with this built in, but you just got to remember is, can I find the can I find the phone if it's lost? Can I wipe it if it's lost? And most of the carriers, including AT&T, do have services that facilitate that. Accept app updates and patches. You want to do those. You want to always patch, and phones becoming more and more crucial to our environment and to our lives, and so you want to make sure it's as secure and safe as it can be. Be smart on open Wi-Fi. Well, there's a whole other program there. You want to make sure that when you connect, you're sitting in your neighborhood coffee house. You want to make sure that you actually connect to something that's legitimate and clean. That you do things that aren't necessarily private. You want to do things that are more public. You want to not enter passwords. Those are the types of things that you want to be cognizant of. Wipe your data. I'm sitting here at home, and I got probably about 5 or 6 phones that are in a drawer because I haven't wiped them yet. Well, I'm not going to turn them in. I'm not going to recycle them, unfortunately, until I make sure that I know that they are completely clean. And honestly, if I don't know that they're clean, I'm probably going to destroy them in some fashion. And report a stolen smartphone. That's the number 10, and that's the last one here. It's something you own. If you have a device stolen, call the authorities. Law enforcement will take, it's a stolen property. And also call your carrier. Contact the carrier and say, hey, this device is stolen. I don't know if I'm going to get it back. It's kind of like a credit card. We talk about that. RFIDs, NFCs. You got to be aware that your device can actually charge things. Turn it off. Get it offline as quickly as possible. Like I said, mostly common sense things, but in a concise, per operating system, per handset type setting. This was a really good website.
Yeah, I agree with you. Sometimes it really helps just to have a list and see it written down, so that you can kind of go through and say, oh yeah, I'm doing that, I'm doing that, I'm doing this. Oh, wait a second, maybe I didn't think about this one, So it always helps to have a list just to make sure that you're doing your own sanity checking in terms of your security posture with your mobile device. The one observation I had, just as you were going through these, where you said accept updates and patches to your smartphone software, I bet you money, although I haven't checked this, but I bet money I have more apps on my smartphone than I do on my, PC in terms of software packages. You install all these little apps all the time. You got hundreds of them, and it's a good idea to go regularly check to see if there's updates, especially for important ones that might have a bug or some vulnerability associated with them. So some good suggestions there.
For me, number 9, wipe data on your phone before you dispose of it, really kind of hits home. At one point, I acquired through certain channels a previously used iPhone, and the owner had not done this. And it was astounding what sort of things I could have done, had I opted to. The Starbucks, the application where you can just scan a QR code and charge things to a Starbucks, loyalty card, American Airlines ticketing. I mean, the list went on and on of how many things could have been accessed simply through this one person's phone, and they didn't bother to clean it up. So that one, I would stress that one. If you're going to get rid of a phone, make sure that nothing is still connected to it.
All right, excellent tips. And like you said, what I like about it is it's nice and easy for the layperson to understand. FCC made a nice, simple list here that pretty much anybody can go read, and they don't have to be high-tech in order to understand what they're talking about. All right, so let's take a look at the Internet weather for this week. So the first one, port 8001 TCP, registered in IANA as VCOM tunnel. More than likely, this is going to be some sort of web scanning traffic. 8000, 8001, a lot of the 8000 area ports are well known to be used for HTTP-type traffic as an alternate HTTP port. We're seeing a large increase in traffic that just started. Interestingly, it started right at 0000 hours UTC this morning. And we don't really have much scanning activity otherwise. You can see there's a very low noise floor of pretty much no activity in terms of scanning on this port. But we did see a large increase, about 4 million flows per hour, scan flows, and it's a single source in China. I'm going to guess that they're scanning for some sort of HTTP-type traffic or something listening on port 8001 that's probably HTTP. But I could be wrong as well. In any event, another one, just wanted to keep an eye out for, especially if you're running anything on port 8001. You'd want to take a look at that and make sure that it's not being abused. So the next one we have here is another interesting one. We have a lot of scanning from a small number of sources in China and the U.S., and it's on various ports. Again, I suspect this is probably HTTP-type scanning. So it's on ports 8000, 8009, and 8090 TCP. Again, I had already mentioned 8001. This is a different set of actors involved in this scanning. They're all scanning these three separate ports on various occasions here. There's probably been a more dramatic increase you can see over the past couple of days here than there had been in terms of a scanning. And there's notably a large swath of steady traffic on 8000 TCP that they were scanning for a period of time. So again, probably HTTP, another one just to keep an eye out on. If you're running anything listening on these ports that are internet facing, you'd want to be mindful of that. Next one on the list here is 21 TCP. We generally have some level of a noise floor scanning activity always. This is the FTP control. So if you're going to FTP, FTP is a file transfer protocol. A lot of people are familiar with that. This activity, I would suspect, is someone looking for either vulnerable FTP software and or trying to brute force their way into an FTP server, probably so that they can do whatever they want with it. The primary source by a large measure is a couple of sources in Hungary. But there's also some number of sources in China and the U.S. also participate in this activity. We had a large spike back on August 22nd of scanning here, and then another shorter spike of about the same volume that occurred earlier today, 8/27. So if you have FTP exposed to the internet, another one to keep an eye out for, and there is an increase in activity for periods of time where people are scanning for systems listening on 21 TCP. This one's an interesting one. Don't really know what this actor's up to, but we have I believe it was a single actor it's a single source IP that's scanning on 4 ports on a very regular basis. So first one I'll point out here is the 1723 TCP, which is PPTP, point-to-point tunneling protocol, which is used for VPN type things. The interesting thing about this is this person is scanning this very regularly over and over again. I can also tell just by the shape of this, we've talked about this on previous programs, if you look at this repeatable pattern here, you'll see 2 kind of large, tall spikes next to each other, a little bit of a gap, and then a shorter spike next to it. And that pattern repeats in this kind of gold yellowish color here. For the most part, it repeats over and over again. In large part, that is usually a fingerprint that I associate with someone scanning across the IP address space from 0.0.0.0 all the way up to 255.255.255. And this kind of pattern emerges because of our address space and how we have more density in certain areas of that when you look through it sequentially. And when I say we, I mean AT&T. So this kind of pattern emerges of two tall spikes, a little bit of a gap, a lower spike, and then usually there'll be a little bit more towards the tail end here as well. But they're definitely repeating the same kind of sequential scanning on that particular port.
John, I noticed, the 9090, it rang a bell. As I remember that being used for some versions of the Zeus approach, and so I just wonder if this is not some variation of Zeus.
I'm not going to discount that. I'm aware of that as well. So the admin port on Zeus, Zeus's web admin port, was typically port 9090. You're correct in that. I'm not quite sure. I mean, somebody could be scanning for Zeus admin portals out there on the Internet. That's possible as well. There's not as much scanning of that going on. The 9090 is in red, so we have some, kind of little bumps of it here. Interestingly, this actor that was scanning 3127 in the middle of yesterday, he was doing that in blue. It looks like he almost stopped literally and then switched over to 9090 at the same volumes, probably in the same address ranges, which is a little interesting because they meet up so perfectly together. I didn't actually confirm the ranges he's scanning at exact precise times, but it looks kind of like that was happening there. So, like we said, 9090, it's often used as a web admin port. For Zeus is one. It's also well known to be used for HP OpenView, I think, as well, for their administrative port, ironically. And so not quite sure what they're scanning for there, but, as with these other ones that we've talked about, if you're running any services that listen on these ports, you probably want to make sure that, it's filtered to only those people that need to access it. And if it's open to the world, you might want to make sure you've got some good logging in place to see if there's anything unexpected happening there. Okay, so in terms of the top 10 list here, this is the most probed ports, not the most people scanning on particular ports, but the most probed ports overall in total. And 53 UDP has really been rising to the top here. I'm going to suspect that people scanning, either scanning for DNS servers that they can use in reflection attacks or amplification attacks, and or it could be some backscatter type activity related to DNS amplification attacks as well. But it's accounting for probably, I'm eyeballing it here, but it's probably about 20%-ish or something of the pie chart here. It's 53 UDP. If you have open resolvers in your network that are exposed to the Internet and anybody can use it to do DNS queries, I'd caution you to go take a look at that and make sure it's not being abused as a third party in a DNS amplification attack. So that's a good thing to go check out. Sometimes people aren't even aware that their DNS servers are set up in such a way. But if you're not sure, easiest thing to do is go to some place that's outside your network, try to do a DNS query against your DNS server for some well-known thing that's not part of your company's DNS, and see if you get a response or not. 445 TCP, well known. We see tons of config or other types of infections targeting this is a well-known port that's vulnerable over the years historically, and there's lots of worm infections still out there related to scanning, looking for any more that they can scoop up. 1433 TCP, Microsoft SQL Server, another one that's typically abused or seen scanning, and could be also brute force attacks trying to get into that SQL interface. 3389 TCP, remote desktop protocol. We talk about the remote access services a lot. There's a few others here. 23 TCP Telnet, 22 TCP SSH. All of those are your remote access types of protocols in terms of getting access to the machine. So those ones are ones you really want to be careful about, because if you have them exposed to the Internet and anybody can connect to them, you're going to see lots of brute force password guessing activity against those to try to break into them. Unless you have something, in place to try to lock people out or block the IP after too many invalid attempts, et cetera, which is something I would recommend if you are able to implement that. 8080 TCP, again, this is another HTTP alternate type port. I've mentioned in the past that Tomcat administration server runs on this. Seen a lot of scanning for Tomcat administration server in terms of abuse. people trying to leverage that and, again, brute force their way into it and guess the Tomcat password. So don't leave it as the default password. If you do have it exposed to the Internet, I would question why do you have your admin interface exposed to the Internet. You should, lock that down only to address blocks, IP address blocks that should be able to get in there. And then the ADTCP could just be other regular scanning for other web-type services. Lastly on the list here is 16464 UDP, which has been consistently trailing off the list here, which is a good thing. This is related to the zero-access botnet. Used to be way up in the top list. We might actually see it a little bit more prevalently in the next slide here, but it's definitely been decreasing. We're seeing a lot of activity. I think some of the the antivirus vendors have, not sure which, can't remember which, did some took some action to mitigate a lot of the zero-access infections out there. So it looks like that has taken effect. And we looked at a slide a couple of weeks ago that kind of showed how significantly the number of zero-access infections we're seeing in our scan data, just from the peer-to-peer UDP traffic that they generate. And then in terms of the most sources probing, these are the most number of individual IPs probing, so by the number of IPs scanning for that. So in this case, you see that 53 UDP slides off that list, which, again, makes me think that it's a small number of actors doing a lot of scanning on 53 UDP on that previous slide. In this case, we've got a lot of actors scanning for 445 TCP, which really, helps, correlate to the fact there's probably a lot of configure infections still out there or other botnets and malware related to scanning on that particular port, looking to recruit new devices into their botnet. These are the zero-access ones, so 16464, 16471, 470, 465. All four of those are related to the zero-access botnet peer-to-peer protocol. I did say it is decreasing. It's definitely decreasing, even though it's in our top 10 list here, but it's getting better. Used to be worse. So that's a good sign in the right direction. And then we have 23 TCP Telnet. There's always actors out there scanning for 23 TCP. There's actually a couple of different avenues of why they do that. There's still a lot of latent Solaris WANEC infections out there. I know that sounds insane that they're still out there at this day and age, but there's still devices out there scanning that have the WANEC infection. It's the old Solaris vulnerability, and it was a worm that kind of infected a lot of machines, and there's still a lot of machines out there that are scanning on that. 3389 TCP, again, remote desktop protocol. Another one that has a worm involved, which could account for the larger numbers of sources probing on this port. So Mordo worm is another one that's out there, and it spreads by brute forcing its way into, remote desktop protocol, machines running already remote desktop protocol. And I did a study a while back, God, it has to be over a year and a half or something, where I set up a machine with remote desktop protocol. I put it on the Internet at home, let machines connect into it, and within, I think it was less than 30 minutes, it was infected with Mordo. So quickly that I didn't even get a chance to set up my scripts to monitor it. But I noticed that it was already infected. So there are Mordo infections out there. So if you have your machine open, exposed to the Internet on port 3389 TCP, you'd want to be careful there. The only upside with Mordo is that, for the most part, it has a very limited list of logins and passwords it tries. So unless you're using really, the passwords that we tell you not to use all the time because they're too simple, if you're using one of those, Mordo could, impact you. But otherwise, if you use a nice, strong password, it's less likely to happen because it doesn't really try random combinations from what I recall. Okay, so that's the show for today. As always, if you'd like to get in touch with us, we'd love to hear from everybody. You can email us at threattrak@list.att.com. And we're also available on Twitter. So you can find us on Twitter at ThreatTraq. And this ThreatTraq video is available at att.com/ThreatTraq and on YouTube. We also have an audio-only version that is available on iTunes. As always, thank you for joining us today. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, keep your network safe.